Hello, and welcome to Agents of Impact, a podcast from Impact Alpha. This is another in our series of conversations with agents of impact across the landscape of impact investing, sustainable finance, venture capital, private equity, and of course, founders and entrepreneurs. I'm David Bank, editor and CEO of Impact Alpha, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sherrell Dorsey, a contributing editor at Impact Alpha. Hi, Sherrell.
Hey, David. I'm glad to be back again.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Aina Abiodun of VertueLab.
Absolutely. Aina is such a unique person in this space, particularly around climate-centered investments, and had recently joined as CEO of VertueLab. And so we got her, I think, for this conversation at a really strong time of her making that transition to leading up VertueLab, which invests specifically in climate tech companies, like early stage climate tech companies. They're based out of the Pacific Northwest, but doing business and investments across the landscape. And Aina brings up a lot around both justice and equity, but then also I think some of the conversations we've been having at Impact Alpha around the Infrastructure Reinvestment Act and sort of this new and next opportunity where not just like government and federal, funding that's going to be going into a lot of these projects to really kind of super speed investments in everything from renewable energy to smarter roads to what have you. But also, Aina was great at breaking down how that also impacts the way that funders, everyone from like the philanthropic spaces to your traditional venture capital, are starting to think about endowments, and also sort of, when we're looking at what endowments invest in, how some of these managers are starting to lean towards, climate tech is sort of the topic du jour. So I really loved this discussion and sort of the foreshadowing of these kind of private room happenings that are taking place. And Aina just kind of beautifully mapped this out around the larger question, or excuse me, the larger conversation on how does this now trickle into also a conversation around justice, equity, and who gets to kind of build, in this new space of green tech and climate tech.
Absolutely, and as you say, also a focus on local and sort of place-based, and we know that that's important in the context of of electrifying buildings and laying in infrastructure, community infrastructure, as you said, but also important in the context of supporting entrepreneurs and founders in places close to the problems that they're trying to solve.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. Welcome to Plugged In, a series of live discussions presented by Impact Alpha. I'm your host, Sherrell Dorsey, and I am excited to be here with Aina Abiodun, whose last name I am going to master before the end of this conversation. And Aina is the president and executive director of VertueLab's. And let's go ahead and jump in. Aina, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. It's exciting to have you. Where are you in the world? Because I know that you're like a
I'm actually in Seattle. I've just hustled back from Salem, where I just testified at the Oregon legislature for a climate bill. So that's really exciting right now.
That is really exciting. Wow, 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 wow. I mean, clearly you are a woman about the work. So you're a serial founder. You've lived multiple lives. You're one of the first Black women in Germany to run a venture-backed tech company,
Yes.
which is absolutely phenomenal. You've lived all over the world. You were recently, named executive director of VertueLab in my hometown of Seattle. Well, the Pacific Northwest is a region for sure, which is exciting.
Yes.
I want you to walk us through your unique journey into your work in climate innovation and justice, how you got here today.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I'm always justice and equity first. There is no world in which I'm not asking myself, is what I'm creating valuable and helpful to folks who are typically underserved? I'm thinking about that as an entrepreneur. I'm thinking about that as a person. And now I'm thinking about it as someone who runs an organization that has a lot of tentacles across the board. So like I said, I was testifying yesterday at the Oregon legislature. There's different scales of impact that you can have across the board. And I really tried to be intentional and thoughtful about how I can contribute to that. And the climate thing was a natural outgrowth from from all my entrepreneurial activities, because at some point, it's like I said yesterday at the legislature, there is no job that won't be a green job at some point. We are all going to be facing a world where we have to deal with the impact of climate change and adapt ourselves to how the world is going to have to work. So if you're in business, I don't care if you're in a consumer product business or what you are, you got to think about how are we going to adapt, either based on resources or based on the sustainability of your product. So it feels like the one universal thread that's running through so many businesses right now.
I want to talk about the goals of VertueLab. You bring this interesting kind of social justice as well as diversity lens into how VertueLab will recruit, or perhaps this might be part of that mission. But I'd love to learn a little bit more generally about your goals at VertueLab.
Yeah, sure. So VertueLab, just for context, is a 15-year-old organization. It's one of the oldest climate innovation organizations in the Pacific Northwest. Folks might not know that Oregon in particular led the charge on, for example, LEED building standards and sustainability in cross-laminated timber and a whole host of really early innovations in climate. So the organization was founded out of that moment. Now, obviously, we are 15 years on. The world is super different. I'm only the second person to run the org. The person who started and founded it left. And, it was a big shift and a big moment for us to take the organization into the future. And I won't say we're in the future yet, but we're aiming it in the right direction. So what we're doing now is really taking a look at the value of being here in this region. So I think there are a lot of accelerators and incubators who think about just sector-based work, or we just want to get the best and the brightest. And I always say, like, there's definitely accelerators who think of themselves as like the Harvard of, whatever it is, AI, or, the way they think about themselves is to go around the world and call the most elite people to do that work. And it's beautiful and serving up a nice dish to VCs. That's amazing. But I think this moment calls for something slightly different. I came into the role about a year after the IRA passed. In fact, my very first day in Seattle was the IRA celebration with VP Kamala Harris, who came to Seattle to do her 1-year anniversary tour. And like literally I get off the plane and I go and have that moment of the IRA. And it was really like this moment. And they chose Seattle because Seattle has really moved the needle in so many ways. That's just to set the stage to how the federal landscape is changing the work that we do. Had I taken this job a year ago or 2 years ago, I think the agenda would be different. So one thing that is baked into the IRA is this focus on justice 40, justice and equity. And so that gives us a little bit of steam and a little bit of firepower to be able to advance this agenda. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a diverse landscape, both naturally and of people with different needs, completely different needs, right? And the challenge, I think, when you think only about the Harvards of all the, climate incubators, et cetera, is that they are not necessarily building for the people that occupy the lands that we live on here. By that, I really mean, thinking about what is the best innovation that's going to serve the people who live in the Pacific Northwest. And the reality is, because climate change is climate change, our natural landscape and the ways in which we've interacted with our landscape, whether we lost our lands, whether we were colonized in some way, whatever that story was, is now telling the story of what needs to be restored. And if we can't dig into that story, we can't serve as folks who are doing innovation in climate. So that's the lens, just to set the stage through which I came into this role, understanding that that was going to be the assignment.
Part of the things that you highlighted, Aina, were the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which last year President Biden signed in, I believe it was about $400 billion of funding towards solutions that would reduce, or essentially focusing on energy projects and things like that, that would help to meet some of our sustainability goals, I believe, by 2050 as a nation, and those resources sort of being dispersed across cities and states for various infrastructure projects. Is that correct, Aina?
That is correct. So the billions of dollars, and this is what I told the committee in the legislature yesterday, is historic, beyond proportions. I mean, if you just look at the chart, I shared a chart yesterday in terms of federal investment in any climate or energy related projects. Literally, the chart goes from this much to this much in the span of 2 years. The amount that will be deployed, if we continue to move in the right direction, fingers crossed, will be trillions by 2030. And it's not just money that's being thrown at projects to just be flushed down the toilet. These are big infrastructure projects that the federal government is investing in. Most of that money is flowing through the states, and that money will be, by and large, determined by these state grants that are giving. There's some flowing directly to consumers. That's your heat pump upgrade, your home improvements that are going to make you more resilient. And then some of them are going to individual nonprofits, native groups, individual organizations that are doing large scale infrastructure work, including utilities. So that money is coming for many different projects, and it's kind of sliced and diced based on different priorities that the administration has identified. And just to put a pin on the Justice 40, that is 40% of certain funds have to be spent in distressed communities or communities that have been underserved historically. So that could do with income level, that could do with environmental degradation, that could deal with your historic marginalization based on your race, based on your religion, that sort of thing. So that's really the way that the federal government has framed it.
In addition to kind of seeing this monumental and unprecedented dollar amount, specifically targeting these like infrastructure projects related to green, clean energy, in sort of capital projects and improvements that will support distressed communities. One of the things that has been really, really fascinating to watch is the level of VC funding that has been expanded into clean tech and clean energy startups and projects, and that has proliferated pretty exponentially. I think even just over the last 3 years, I was able to find a stat that did a Crunchbase analysis where funding in VC just in the US towards clean energy startups went from 1.9 billion in 2019 to over 12.3 billion in 2022. And it'll be interesting to see where we land here in 2023. And this is really despite a contraction in the broader VC market space, as you're very aware, which has slowed and declined. And as we look at interest rates and sort of the economics of the market currently, you're seeing the tightening of belts in VC around the board, but clean tech is really starting to proliferate. So as a leader in both these kind of philanthropic supported funds and investment funds from like private spaces, where you're serving in sort of this advisory in kind of council capacity, what types of conversations and commitments are you seeing on the ground? Like, how has that really changed over time as you've been in this work?
Yeah, so I actually think that the conversation is still evolving really rapidly right now. So I'll give you a picture. So it was in the spring of this year, I was at a meeting for asset managers, and these were asset managers who managed these huge foundations, endowments, right? And one of the conversations I had with one particular asset manager was, hey, now that the IRA is rolling out, what do you see as the opportunity for asset managers to leverage this basically, de-risking of your funding? And by the way, I'll just say these particular asset managers were very impact focused. And so they were thinking about what's a better way if you're a large philanthropy to leverage your endowment. And I just want to give a little insight into that for folks who are not familiar. So aside from the grant making work that a lot of these large organizations, nonprofits do, they also have their core endowment, and it's out of the core endowment that they're then it's basically the interest on their endowment. Some people joke and say that by the time they're done writing the check to you, they've already made the money back in their endowment. And there's a big conversation around, okay, say you want to, spend X amount on climate. Is your investment, your core investment that you're making money on, is that a just and equitable investment? Are you investing in oil and gas on one side and then, and then giving money to a climate organization on the other side, right? So the question then became, for the endowment, you're looking for a return. It's not a grant. It's not for free. It's how they say business.
Right.
And so in that sense, what are some ways that they can then leverage that funding to make market rate returns in the impact investing space? What was interesting was that was probably in May, right? And I had an ongoing conversation. At that moment, these asset managers were unsure. They were unsure of like, well, how's the IRA gonna really help? I mean, honestly, it's the government. You never know when they're going to move. You never know what's going to happen. And in the 4-5 months after that, we started to see capital moving, and it was really moving quickly. And I think that was because once projects got in the ground and folks started to see what the economic opportunities were, they started to really crowd in. And I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I shared with the legislature that in the state of New York, which is I still consider to be my home, even though I'm now in a new home. The $5 billion, and it sounds like a lot, but when you're thinking about big infrastructure, it's not. The $5 billion that was leveraged from IRA funds, government funds, turned, and that's investment, turned into $57 billion of private investment that came into the state in the same period, which is exactly the point of the Biden administration's project was, hey, if we de-risk the first $5 billion, can we get more money? And actually, my point to the Oregon legislature is we are lagging in the Pacific Northwest in this regard. We have not been able to take that seed money, that capital, and leverage it in a way that then yields 6x or 7x other investments. We're obviously not talking about returns yet, but just the core investments, right? And so that's the point. The point, and they've said it, I know people miss this, is that they want to make it easy for private investors to come in because the hard laying of the groundwork is done. And then they just come in and, start to really flush in some commercialization money, some deployment money where the projects aren't as risky anymore.
Yeah, there's an interesting sort of all hands in approach to this that's really fascinating. I think that we kind of have seen this proliferate with the electric vehicle spaces as well, where we know that was a lot of investment, government centered spending and loans that helped to power a lot of the early stages of Tesla, right? And then sort of how that innovation, and for better or for worse, because I know that can be a little controversial, but for better or for worse, you do see the manufacturing and support, and even as we look at car sales in these last few years, for the transition to electric vehicles. But it sounds like when we look at the deployment of that seed infrastructure dollars coming out of initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act, it has these downstream effects for the market. And I know that we haven't had this conversation specifically, but I also think about the opportunities right now as we look at, the tech industry and just many companies that are conducting these layoffs. And even though the job market is still considered to be very strong, that transition into green jobs has a really fascinating through line that is going to be interesting as dollars continue to get flooded into this space. When we do see these companies that start to grow because the infrastructure has been laid, and then VCs are able to come in and say, yes, build the next unicorn that is specifically going to be solving some of these issues. Oh, and by the way, you're going to be hiring 2,000 people across the world, or potentially within the community itself. And so I'd love for you to speak to just even the workforce development opportunity and whether or not that was part of the conversation that you had as you testified yesterday.
Yes, absolutely. So what you should know is that I testified to the House Economic Development Committee. The question of how we were going to put sort of more money in the budget for climate had kind of been bouncing around the Oregon legislature. And interestingly enough, it landed in economic development because it needs to be in economic development, because it is a function of how you grow businesses in the state. Now, the question around what do those jobs really look like falls into a bunch of different categories, right? So there have been some manufacturing grants that have gone out to different states to complement some of the money that has come through the IRA. So maybe you got some funding to run a hydrogen hub, but then you also got some funding as a state to run, actually to set up a plant to manufacture supply chain components that then serve that hydrogen hub, right? So then it starts to kind of cascade out into something a lot bigger in terms of a regional hub and a workforce opportunity. I think there is not enough knowledge. And if I have one criticism of this administration, it's that although they say workforce, people don't really, it doesn't click. My work in the market suggests suggest that it doesn't click for folks. Like, what does workforce actually really mean? Well, here's what it means. It means that if you do set up manufacturing, you have hopefully well-paying union jobs that folks can have in the manufacturing space. And thank God, all these different initiatives in a lot of states that have climate work are starting to work directly with unions so that they can make sure that these are good, solid jobs that are coming back into communities. So there's that on one side. But then we have other kinds of jobs. And so at VertueLab, we work with entrepreneurs to create lots and lots of different kinds of opportunities, including business innovation. And I'll use EV chargers as an example, right? So you can buy a McDonald's franchise or you can start an EV franchise, okay? So there's many ways you can slice this. You can be a business owner who creates jobs because you're taking advantage of the infrastructure that's being built through the climate economy, through the green economy. So that's a different kind of job, right? So you've got business owners, and people often mistakenly think that climate entrepreneurship is only people in a lab, building first of a kind technology. That is not the case. There's lots of scaling and supply chain pieces of the puzzle. So entrepreneurs who are maybe small business owners can contribute to that whole workforce opportunity. And then I want to put a pin in one other thing, which is that electricians are in such high demand right now.
Yes.
That anybody who is looking for a job needs to be an electrician. And I'm going to say this also, especially women, because women have been locked out of a lot of these kinds of jobs. And being an electrician, and I'll just put a plug for BOSS, the Black Owners of Solar Services.
I was just going to mention them. I love them.
I love them. So I've just recently been asked to join their board, and they're wonderful. They've been the recipient of a grant for training folks out of the Biden administration to do work in the solar industry. So, so that we can expand our workforce in the trades. And one thing I'll just say as a Black person is that I know that we are told that we should be focused on all these elite, again, the Harvards of everything. But electricians make more money than I ever made as an entrepreneur. Like, honestly, and then if you decide you want to be a solar installer or own a business or, kind of expand what you're doing, that baseline of doing the trades is where it's at right now.
Yes. I love that you mentioned that, because there's also this opportunity for even getting federal and state contracts for some of this work as well. Whether you're in construction, you can serve as a subcontractor. There's plenty of opportunity out there in a trade-centered orientation and the people who literally build the infrastructure of our country.
100%. There has not been a moment where we've had to build, 55 million lines, transmission lines, rebuild them so that we can deal with the infrastructure that's coming in from the entire renewable energy infrastructure. So this moment is the moment. This is the moment to be an electrician. And I'm just going to pitch that again and again. I mean, there's so many things you can do. And it's, it takes some time to train and it takes some time to get there, but it's so well worth considering it and dropping some of the trappings around, the elitism around why you should or should not become a tradesperson.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, especially when we look to what are going to be the future of credentials. There's some incredible work that Jobs for the Future has been pushing out there, and a lot of research on high quality jobs. And then also, how employers can start to kind of get into this model of earn and learn. So, being able to train, get paid to sustain your livelihood, and get access to things like apprenticeships or internships, or things that are also going to lead to that full-time employment with the specific job skills that you need to be able to go in and do your job on day one, excel, and continue to move up the pipeline. So I love the way that you framed this out. I want to get to some of the questions here from our viewers. So David Bank, editor and founder of Impact Alpha is in the room today and asks, what are the challenges and solutions to getting that IRA money into communities? I'm curious about this as well.
So I'm really glad you asked that question, because that is at the core of what we are doing right now in the Pacific Northwest at VertueLab's. So we've actually just launched something we're calling JFC Labs, which is Just Futures Climate Labs. And this is a unit in our organization that we're using to reimagine how we can support a variety of entities in this transition when there's a lot of money. So one of the key conversations we've been having with all these different stakeholders is communities. So getting the money turns out to not maybe have been so challenging for a lot of communities, because you can apply, you can get that money in some cases directly from your state or directly from the federal government. So lots of grants have gone out. I would say that is not the bigger challenge. The bigger challenge is actually deploying. So once you have the money and you're in a community, unless you have, for example, a community-led or owned, energy company or some sort of entity that allows you to then immediately get on it and start installing what you need to install, it becomes a real challenge. Community-based organizations are not set up to do climate tech deployment. Okay, they're just not. So there is a need. So there's actually like a sort of a sliver of business here. And I'll reference another bit of work that I've done in Louisiana with the Together New Orleans group that does the community lighthouse there. I'm also on their board, and they've been working to get community-based solar projects out in faith-based institutions all over the state. And one of the challenges we've had, right, is that, and they've been the beneficiary of some IRA money, is you need to find a developer who can work at the sort of pace and the scale that you need. So pace meaning you may need community buy-in. It's not just going to happen like you get the money and then all of a sudden it all happens. There's a lot of stuff that has to be done. One of the big hurdles that we had in Louisiana was making sure that the net metering cost, which is the cost that when you feed solar or renewable energy into the grid, you should get market rate back. That's the savings you get for giving the grid renewable energy and not paying all that money to get the energy. Sometimes in a lot of places, you can't actually get that to happen so that it becomes really effective, financially, so that it makes sense. So over the last year, one of the big challenges has been getting the city council to approve or to push the utility to give a consumer rate, a really fair rate back to the folks that are providing this electricity. Now imagine you're a church, you're generating from your big church building tons and tons of energy. It's going into the grid. You get nothing for it. And the whole point of doing it is so that you can then sustain your church and you can continue to use that as a source, both a safe haven for your community, but as a source of revenue to maintain your community organization. So so that's a political battle, right? That's a whole, who's fighting that fight?
Right.
That is our whole thing. There's that, and there's the battle, which is who's the developer that you're going to hire to do this work, that understands how to work with communities in trying to do equitable and more just kind of rollout. So here in Seattle, we're talking to a lot of community orgs who are faced with these kinds of questions and are not finding folks in between. You just don't want to hire some high-priced consultant to come in and tell you how to deploy this technology correctly, or how to work, or how to help you find the financing you need to do the first work you need to do to get the viability of the project online, right? There's that. And then the third thing is really around technology suitability itself, right? So there's typically not a lot of technology know-how inside the community. Is this the right product for this community? Is it going to serve? What are the downstream effects? If I'm concerned because my community has been polluted by all kinds of things, chemicals over the last 30 years, which is true of, Louisiana, it's true of, of Cancer Alley. Am I going to just believe that because you brought some technology that you said is going to be better, that suddenly I should believe you? I need somebody to tell me that this thing is not going to harm me or my kids or my family,
Right.
And so that bit of work, that is the equity and justice work that has to be done. Is it fair? Is it good for us? Should we be deploying this technology? Should we just do it because we have the money, or do we need it, or what do we need? That's the work that we're digging. We have kind of 3 pillars in our lab right now. And one thing we're trying to figure out is how can we serve better organizations that are going through this transition? Because there's a big learning curve. There's a big need for all kinds of services. And how can we make sure that we don't, IRA is a use it or lose it kind of thing, right? So you got to use it. And so how do we get there, and how do we do it faster?
I want to define this idea of place-based innovation. I think as I've kind of Googled you and done research on you, there's this term that pops up a lot. And I think it sounds like, community-centered sort of work, but perhaps you can help define the term a little bit for us and sort of how climate innovation activism plays a role in its principles of this idea of place-based innovation.
Yeah, so I'll say like a lot of my thinking around that came from living and working in Europe. So I spent the last 4.5 years before, well, I've been back for about a year and a half now, working in Germany. And I started my first climate tech business there. And one of the things when you look around Europe as a whole is, I mean, certainly Europe is a lot, the countries and cities are a lot smaller than ours. But what you found was that a large number of the initiatives that were successful, for example, greening transportation, decarbonizing city buildings, they came out of very specific inquiries around certain problems with urban design or with transportation design. And the way they've been able to move the needle and actually get projects done and, raise bonds against projects is that the folks who are like living it are the ones who are also thinking about solving the problem. And in my mind, I think there is a tendency in venture capital and in finance, because we're thinking about things being exponentially large or how can you scale that business, where we're just always looking for a new market, right? And I think that's counterintuitive to how we have to think about climate, which is I'm standing here right now. It's unusually sunny in the Pacific Northwest, which is why I wasn't prepared. And everything that happens in my space, whether it's a fire or a flood, has direct impact on my life. I can say all I want that I want to create a product that's going to be used all over the world, and I'm selling that to my VCs and it's in my deck. But at the end of the day, the thing that I am most challenged by is the thing I think about the most. It's the thing I think about solving. It's the thing I'm going to talk to my legislators about. It's going to talk to my neighbors, my school district. It's the thing I'm going to pay taxes happily to fix, right? And so I think because the United States is so big and we deal with so many different problems, and I'm working across the board on boards everywhere from the Gulf South to the Pacific Northwest. And what I'm seeing is that we have some similar challenges. And don't get me wrong, there are technologies that are applicable to different regions, right? If you have a forest fire technology, mitigation technology, it might be useful anywhere there's forest fires, right? However, the first line of business is if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm living in a place, or I'm a community member or just a person, and I'm looking for a solution to the thing that ails me in my community, whether that's water and air. Like look at Jackson, Mississippi, right? They have water problems. Like they need more entrepreneurs solving water problems there and not selling global solutions to problems, but like, how do you fix that problem there first and then worry about the rest of the world? And I think entrepreneurs just need to be bolder about that, which is why we've put a stake in the ground and said, like, we're going to look at the problems from the ground up. What are the issues that we're facing here? No one will be better at solving our problems than we are in solving our problems. That does not mean we don't invite, people who are researching and thinking about these same kinds of problems all over the world. But what we're aiming to do, particularly at VertueLab, is to be a justice first, equity-based global leader in how you do place-based innovation. Meaning if we look in our backyard and we can figure out a way that we can solve for what we have here, can we inspire and share and become, a kind of a model for how we think about, listen, the people that we're serving justice-wise are here. I'm not sending money to another continent to solve their problem when I can't figure out how to make sure that these kids in my neighborhood are not breathing in school bus fumes when they're walking to school every day. So I think these are like real critical breakdowns of how we can, it's also a communication thing. It's like folks don't understand climate change. They understand pollution. They understand high energy bills. They understand the things that they are living. And if we want to get folks on board with solutions to climate issues, we need to get them on board with being present in their environment and us supporting in solving those problems.
I just quickly also wanted to turn to the resources and tools for investors and LPs. I think we've been able to speak so much about, this complete lens of climate tech, place-based innovation. But for any of our LPs or soon to be LPs or fund managers that this is not traditionally your wheelhouse, but it might be something that you're considering in terms of adding climate tech or sort of a social justice aspect into the thesis and ethos of the investments and the kind of work that you're attempting to do. And I'd love for you to speak to that part of our audience in terms of how they should really be looking at opportunity in climate innovation, and sort of how also through that they can apply this diversity lens kind of in a broad sense.
Yeah, sure. So I will say that we have historically been a funder, an investor of slow capital, an investor who actually deals in slow capital. So our catalytic fund, our first fund, which is wrapping up now, we largely raised, our LPs were mostly philanthropists and folks who are comfortable with the impacting sort of investment lens of, hey, we're trying to make impact. It might happen slowly, but this is the catalytic capital business that we're in, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in the couple of years since that fund was raised, there's been a lot more conversation around catalytic capital overall. So catalytic capital will be investing where other folks fear to tread, too early, too risky, too, areas where people might not feel super comfortable, but it also tends to overlap with underserved founders, markets that folks are not really betting on, but there's something there. So we're able to take risks in ways that other folks are not. So that's been the catalytic venture fund side of the business that we've run. And as I mentioned earlier, our VertueLab's project also has, in addition to our community work that we're trying to uncover, a whole pillar around funding. And that's because the funding market in general has evolved significantly, and the ways in which we can be impactful for entrepreneurs through funding is really varied. So I would say there's like a couple of buckets that we are sort of dealing with. One is obviously venture capital, which is traditional to some extent, but we have some latitude. We are in the process now of standing up a new venture fund. So that's going to be a really incredible opportunity to do some place-based innovation with us. And then the other pieces are grants. So we have helped entrepreneurs at various stages of their business get up to, I think, $20 million in grants from the federal government. Folks don't know how much money is sitting on the table. Non-dilutive capital, go in the lab, go finish working on your thing before you have to, get into dilutive capital, right? So we've done that, and we'll continue to support and find new ways of helping folks get grants. Okay, so there's that. Then there's also catalytic debt, which is something that touches on another hat that I wear, which is the Candide Fund. So catalytic debt is the Candide Fund, just FYI, y'all reported on it, just announced a $50 million fund, which is really designed to advance projects that are already, cash flow positive and are able to sustain their businesses. They're typically going to be renewable energy with funding models like, PPAs and tax credits and things where there's some sense of where that's going, but still catalytic in the sense that they might be too small to qualify for bigger debt facilities. And so what, Candide is doing is and I'm part of the couple of the ICs and the community advisory board, helping think through who needs this money, like who needs this catalytic debt, and how can we fill in a gap that nobody else is willing to fill in. So the debt category is really interesting right now. It's interesting for two reasons. One is it's an area that philanthropists can play. These are recoverable, right? So you can still invest, if you will. You're getting some return, but it's not going to be VC style returns, right? Then the last little piece of that is that with this other historic funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that's coming through the EPA, which will be announced in the spring, I think almost every state will have a facility that will be run through potentially a CDFI, which is a community bank, or some local entity that will then support entrepreneurs potentially again in more proven technologies, but we're hoping that maybe there might be a little bit of first of a kind and some other opportunities to get funding to move their businesses along in a meaningful way. This is $14 billion with a B, dollars. that is going to flow through and really energize a lot of entrepreneurs. So one of the ways in which we're thinking about it is like, listen, now there's all these tools that are going to be de-risking businesses at different levels. Some of them are debt. Some of them is grant money. Some of it is venture money. There's other kind of lending that's coming online. And so what we're doing is we're thinking about, for our purposes, for the purpose of justice and equity, how can we enable entrepreneurs, communities, projects that might not have access to and may not want to be, they might not be a venture case, right? But still have huge impacts that they can deliver. How can we support them, and what are the funding mechanisms that we can stand up to make that possible? So we're building out, I would say, a layer cake of many different funding opportunities so that you as an entrepreneur can come in and say, I have this project, and we say, okay, well, this option might be good for you, that might be good for you, but no one is doing that right now. People are very specialized in how they think about either the vertical or the type of funding they provide. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to be facing the people that we want to serve and say, what do you need? And let's provide what you need. Not, I'm selling you this, you must buy it. We as entrepreneurs, as VCs, we're always telling entrepreneurs, hey, you need to tell the market, you need to know what the market wants. And the thing is, our market is our entrepreneurs. They're diverse, they're underserved. Like, what do they need? They need capital, sometimes little infusions of capital from time to time to get through whatever they're trying to get through.
Yeah, and quickly. So it sounds like there's some steps and levels, almost like going to the grocery store to shop for like what you need for dinner. And you kind of need that, pretty quickly, your solutions like available kind of right then and there. No, really love that. Thank you so much, Aina, for this conversation, for sharing so much of your wisdom, your expertise.
Well, thank you for having me. I mean, I have to say, I'm so grateful for you for doing this, for having these conversations. I told you I was super inspired by the Black Farmers Fund conversation you had. And I was like, oh, I need to do something like that. That's amazing. So I'm really happy that I got to be part of it. And I'm grateful for Impact Alpha for doing the work that you all do. And thank you to the audience for joining and engaging and geeking out with us for a minute, and hopefully being on that journey.
Thanks for bringing that conversation to us, Sherrell.
Yeah, absolutely. I really enjoyed speaking with Aina, and I'm looking forward to, what Virtue will be doing moving forward, but also just how the space is moving as well.
A lot going on. I want to remind our listeners that they can see all the shows in the Impact Alpha podcasting network at impactalpha.com. And while you're there, make sure to sign up for our free weekly newsletter, Impact Alpha Open, or go all in and subscribe to Impact Alpha to get our daily brief in your inbox each morning and our many other cool features. And make sure to subscribe to Impact Alpha on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.